How can the federal government improve its process for the acquisition of architectural and engineering services? What suggestions would you, specific suggestions would you make?
We actually find the IDIQ process to be very advantageous, and a number of agencies have very successfully implemented IDIQs. The A&E community operates very differently than our construction friends. We're generally held to professional liability requirements and not a performance bond requirement, and it is not as capital intensive as some of the construction activities. So the problems that Mr. Zelenka identified are not the same in our community. IDIQs actually work very well, and it's an opportunity for an agency, particularly when their requirements over a year or over a period of years are not well defined. They can basically do a competitive procurement and put firms on retainer and then call on them on an as-needed basis. We're very glad that, for example, the USGS has done that with in a memorandum of understanding with FEMA, so that now in emergency response, when you need aerial photography or mapping after a hurricane, they just activate a task order, but the contract is pre-positioned. So it's a very effective way of using the service when you need it, but then not having to pay for it or pay for a procurement when you don't need it.
Thank you. Mr. Zelenka, how can bidder behavior be improved when reverse auctioning is used?
It's very difficult to police. You have some inherent problems, especially when you look at it from a small business and a large business standpoint. The large business is just in much better position to sustain bigger losses that are inherent with the variables that you're dealing with in construction than small business. So it's very easy for them to look at it and cut a small business number, and if that job goes south, they can absorb the loss. So it's hard to control that behavior. Small business, on the other hand, is faced with a whole different set of problems. In construction, if a job goes south, it's not like manufacturing where when you're doing a reverse auction, you're just cutting away at maybe potential profits and all of your costs are controlled. I mean, you can have a job go bad in our industry, civil works in South Louisiana. A hurricane could come through. You could have some bad weather sustained over long periods and actually lose money, not profits, not overhead, but you go through that and into getting upside down on your production costs. So as you sit there, those are real risks that a small business has to weigh a lot heavier than a large business, and and some people will take that risk, because we're driven by survival as opposed to just increasing our profits. When you're out of business or you're out of work and you're looking for business, you can be tempted to cut below what's reasonable given those weather factors, and it puts a small business at a problem. And I don't know how to control that. We're kind of fighting an uphill battle at that point that large business doesn't even have to consider. They can absorb those losses and move right on to the next project.
Thank you. Mr. Sellis, what acquisition alternatives would you recommend to GSA to, that they pursue that would give small business concerns a greater opportunity to do business with the federal government for travel services?
I think the simple answer is that GSA, if they will agree to implement just set-asides in their contracts, if they put set-asides in their contracts for small businesses, I think in the e-travel side, I think that the TMCs, as were noted, will get more business. And I believe that GSA is going to be open to this, but we have to wait and see.
Thank you. Mr. Leeser, when the National Office Products Alliance or any of its members suspect the existence of a pass-through or fronts, do they notify the Small Business Administration or the agency that's sponsoring the monitoring program, or what should they do?
Typically what a dealer would do, or a GSA schedule holder in our industry would do, was notify NOPA, the National Office Products Alliance, and typically what happens is our counsel, our lobbyist on staff will work with SBA to try to address that issue, and that's happened a number of times in the past. This case with Faison that I mentioned is one that was brought by a dealer in California. The dealer did protest through the proper channels, and with help and through SBA's help, or actual SBA's ruling on the matter, was able to determine that that was truly a front and did have financial ties to a large competitor and was solely for the purpose of gaining access to a contract that was set aside for small business. So the process is typically work through the national organization, trade industry, work through SBA, and see what can be done about it, and go through the typical protest processes that are in place.
Thank you. And then finally, Mr. Spatil, you had mentioned about the plain language communication that our colleague, Mr. Braley, has been initiating and pushing. And could you again discuss why that is why that's such an important piece of legislation, or that concept is one that we ought to pursue?
Well, I think, again, it has a very practical effect on small businesses. Much of the procurement language, the procurement world language, whether it be in the FAR, whether it be contract documents, whether it be even statements of work and solicitations, is very difficult for small businesses to interpret without expensive professional advisors. So all of this builds up additional costs and additional impediments. It makes it more difficult for a small business to compete effectively. And there's no excuse for it, because these things can all be fixed. If decisions are faster and communicated clearly, if expectations are communicated clearly, including statements of work, then a small business can be much more cost conscious, can control the costs of going after these contracts much more effectively, and can make fewer mistakes. And I think all of these things would help considerably.